So welcome to our seminar. It is my real pleasure to introduce Peter Schwabe with you. I will read some of his bio. Peter Schwabe completed his PhD in January 2011 at Eindhoven University of Technology in the coding and cryptography group under the under the supervision of Daniel Lange and Daniel J. Bernstein. Peter is associate editor of the Journal of Computer Security and the Journal of Cryptographic Engineering. He was co-program chair of Latin Crypt 2019 in Santiago, Chile, and he has been member of the editorial board of the IACR Transactions of Cryptography Hardware and Embedded System, better known as TCHES, in 2018, 2019, and 2020. And since 2021, Peter is the editor-in-chief of TCHES. Peter Schwabe is a tenured faculty member at the Max Planck Institute for Security and Privacy and a part-time professor for cryptographic engineering in the Digital Security Group of Radboud University. Since October 2018, Peter is working on the project EPOCH, engineering post-quantum cryptography funded by the European Commission through an ERC starting grant. Peter, this is very relevant for us in TII. Peter is co-author of several of the NIST third round candidates of the PQ standardization effort. This includes Crystal Kyber, Crystal Dilithium, Classic MacLeese, Enthru, and Sphinx Plus. So it is a real pleasure to introduce Peter today. Peter, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Francisco. And thank you very much all for inviting me. So let me share my screen and put up the slides. Let's hope that this works as well as it did in the test session. So you should now all be seeing my slides. Francisco, works?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So as Francisco introduced, I'm currently working mostly within an ERC starting project called EPOCH, which is engineering post-quantum crypto. And that project is closely following and supporting also with its research the NIST standardization effort. But what I wanted to do in this talk is, well, going a little bit beyond the NIST standardization effort, or at least the kind of research that you would mostly see in there. So just as a bit of a reminder, at the very beginning of the NIST standardization effort, I mean, when the first proposals came in December 4, 2017, Jacob Alper and Sheriff tweeted this kind of overview, and I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with the standardization effort, and maybe some of you are involved. So when looking at this, maybe some of you feel a little bit of nostalgia of all of the schemes that have been broken within a few days, and well, also the schemes, of course, that are still in the process now. Now, basically, what NIST is aiming for in this process is to eventually, let's say, probably through the course of the next year, standardize some KEMs, so key encapsulation mechanisms, and some signatures. And I think most people have this idea that, well, with this, we have the critical building blocks to replace public key crypto in the protocols that we're using today. And essentially, we just take whatever protocol we have today, and we rip out the pre-quantum elliptic-curve RSA-based cryptography, drop in the post-quantum equivalence, and we're done. And while that may occasionally work, sometimes it may not work. It may, in many cases, not be the optimal solution. And what I want to give in this talk is two examples of, well, basically thinking beyond the primitives, or seeing or looking into what you can build with these primitives and how to do this in an efficient or maybe optimal way. The challenges that we're facing when looking at post-quantum cryptography on the protocol level is that the primitives that we have available sort of as building blocks, they have massively different performance characteristics from ECC, from the very efficient elliptic curve cryptography with 32-byte public keys and extremely efficient arithmetic. Also, the landscape is much more complex. So with elliptic curve cryptography, we can essentially once optimize a scalar multiplication on a certain elliptic curve, and from there we can build almost everything we need. It's maybe a little bit more complex than that, but we have a rather small trusted code base that we can build our crypto from. And that looks different in a post-quantum world. Also, probably the most widely used asymmetric primitive on the internet is elliptic-curve Diffie-Hellman. Well, together maybe with RSA signatures, but really elliptic-curve Diffie-Hellman is really widely used. And we will see that we don't have a drop-in replacement for Diffie-Hellman in the post-quantum world. Well, at least not really. Also, when looking at signatures, it turns out that the most efficient signatures that we have post-quantumly, they're stateful. So it's the stateful hash-based signatures like XMSS or LMS. And they're forward secure. And forward security is at least rather trivially achieved for stateful signatures, or well, for XMSS and LMS. But it's interesting to figure out, like, what does that even mean for designing protocols? Can we securely maintain state? Can we make use of the fact that they're forward secure and maybe obtain additional guarantees? And then finally, well, when we do protocol proofs, we need to make sure that those proofs still hold against quantum adversaries. So proofs in the random oracle model may need to be moved to the quantum random oracle model, or we need to think about if we can maybe even get standard model proofs. So generally, proofs are more complex. The aspects I want to highlight in this talk are the first three: massively different performance, more complex landscape, and that we don't have a drop-in replacement for Diffie-Hellman. The first example I want to talk about is post-quantum WireGuard. And post-quantum WireGuard is a project that I worked on together with Andreas Hülsing, with Kai-Chen Ning, with Florian Weber, and with Phil Zimmerman. Now, maybe some of you have heard of WireGuard. Maybe some of you are actively using WireGuard. But for those who aren't, let me just quickly remind you what WireGuard is. WireGuard is a modern virtual private network protocol that was presented by Donenfeld at NDSS in 2017. It was merged into the Linux kernel in 2020, and it needs only about 4,000 lines of code for the full VPN server site. It runs over UDP, and probably one of the reasons that it ended up in the mainline Linux kernel is that Linus Torvalds, well, really kind of likes it. So what he said about it is that compared to the horrors that are OpenVPN and IPsec, WireGuard is a work of art. So to us, that sounded like a very good candidate to, well, move to a post-quantum world. But of course, the first, so WireGuard also doesn't use any crypto agility. It is what some people call cryptographically opinionated. So basically, Jason Donenfeld, when designing this, he just said, well, I'm picking the crypto for you. Everybody's just going to use this crypto. This makes the protocol clean and easy, little code, no negotiations of algorithms. So everybody who's using WireGuard basically needs to live with Jason's choices, which is X25519 as Diffie-Hellman key exchange, ChaCha20 poly1305 as an authenticated encryption scheme with associated data, Blake2S for hashing and for keyed hashing, and HKDF for key derivation. It's not the choice I would have made, at least not for some of these primitives, but it's a decent choice. It's very hard to argue why this would be really bad. Now, the WireGuard handshake, so WireGuard protocol basically first uses a handshake to establish a session key, and then afterwards uses the session key for symmetric data encryption. We're not so interested in the symmetric data encryption. That uses ChaCha20 poly1305, 256-bit key. There's not so much concern from a post-quantum perspective. But the handshake uses this X25519, elliptic-curve Diffie-Hellman, which, as we know, will be broken by quantum computers. So how does it do this? Well, essentially, we have an initiator and a responder. You can also think about it as a client and a server in a VPN context. And they each know each other's long-term public keys. And these long-term public keys are Diffie-Hellman keys. So X25519 Diffie-Hellman, elliptic-curve Diffie-Hellman keys. How they know them, this is sort of outside of the protocol flow. Basically, what you can imagine is that a systems administrator just pre-installs them on employees' laptops and correspondingly on the server. So key management of these long-term keys is not part of the discussion in this talk. We just assume those keys are there. And now each of the two parties, initiator and responder, generate an ephemeral key pair, also X25519 key pair. So that would be these keys denoted with E here, and send them over to each other. And now each participant has two secret keys, namely the long-term key and the ephemeral key that they just generated, and two public keys from the other side, namely the long-term public key and the ephemeral public key. So that you can combine each secret key with each public key, which essentially gives you 4 different Diffie-Hellman shared key computations, which we're going to do. And that gives us 4 session keys. And well, we derive the actual session key from those 4 keys. So we do ephemeral, 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 static, static, ephemeral, and static, static, Diffie-Hellman, and put all of this together. In real, this looks a little bit more complex. So this is the actual WireGuard handshake, and that is even leaving out quite some definitions. But you can see in here the Diffie-Hellman key generations. You can see the Diffie-Hellman key generation here. You do not see the shared computation. The shared computation happens in the definitions of these kappas somewhere here. So essentially, throughout this handshake, which is derived from the NIST protocol framework, you're keeping track of sort of 2 hash chains, one deriving keys. So that's where all the shared secrets go in. That's the kappas. And then this H, which essentially keeps track of protocol messages that go back and forth. Then there's messages that also incorporate timestamps to make sure that you have replay protection, and some cookies for early rejection and DOS protection. In the end, you derive a session key. That's something to keep in mind from 4 Diffie-Hellman keys. And well, after this has happened, application data can be sent. The handshake security that we're aiming for here is first key confidentiality. So somebody who's observing the channel, potentially also somebody who has long-term keys compromised, can't break the key confidentiality. Well, this includes in this definition also forward security. So if you compromise long-term keys, then you can't read past sessions. As an active adversary, of course, then you may be able to agree on a new key because you can impersonate, but at least you can't go back to obtaining the session keys of older sessions. Also, entity authentication. So basically that each partner knows who they're talking to. We also want key uniqueness. So if 2 parties run this twice, then they don't end up with the same key every single time. We want identity hiding. So passive adversary listening on the channel does afterwards not know who's communicating with who. Of course, in the real world, you would need to run this over some anonymity solution like Tor, but then at least from the protocol messages, you don't learn who's communicating with who. You want replay attack resistance. You want something known as unknown key share attack resistance, which basically allows an attacker to convince an honest party that they're communicating with some other party than they believe they're communicating to. So this is sort of a special case of entity authentication. And then we want some level of DOS attack resistance, which, well, DOS attacks, denial of service attacks, they're generally hard to mitigate. But the best thing we can do is, well, if somebody is trying to communicate with a server or trying to run denial of service against the server, then the server should be able to close that connection and reject packets as early as possible in the protocol flow. And in particular, before doing many, many costly public key operations that would, well, cost CPU cycles. So the security has been analyzed. Essentially, there were, well, I think still are. So by the time we wrote this, that was last year, there were 2 main analyses of WireGuard and the security of WireGuard. There was a computational analysis by Dowling and Patterson. And, well, basically, they proved the security in the so-called ECK PFS PSK model. So ECK is the enhanced Kraft-Check kinetic Kraft-Check model. And then PFS includes discussion of perfect forward secrecy. PSK also includes a pre-shared key, at least as an optional component in here. The tricky thing is they didn't actually prove ECK, PFS, PSK for the WireGuard handshake. they proved that if you slightly tweak the WireGuard handshake and add a key confirmation message at the end, then it obtains the ECK PFS PSK. Problem is that in order to prove it in this model, you need to cleanly separate handshake messages from data transmission messages. And that's not entirely the case in WireGuard because the first payload message also serves as key confirmation message. So this is not cleanly separated. Also, this proof doesn't prove key uniqueness, identity hiding, and DOS mitigation. Already a bit earlier, Donenfeld and Milner presented a symbolic proof using the Tamarin proof assistant. And that one is missing perfect forward secrecy, replay attack resistance, and DOS mitigation. Of course, when looking into the post-quantum security, it's kind of critical to first understand if, by some chance maybe, it is already secure against quantum attackers. It isn't. But there was a short note in the original paper. And essentially what that short note said is, well, post-quantum cryptography is not practical for use here. But if you're concerned about the scenario that an attacker is recording messages now and then maybe in 15 years decrypting those messages with a large universal quantum computer, you can use a pre-shared symmetric key. And this is optional in WireGuard. If you install this on both ends, then this symmetric key kind of protects you against this, this long, well, attack in the future of recorded messages. In 2019, Applebaum, Martindale, and Wu looked at it. Actually, I think the title of the paper is called a tiny tweak to the WireGuard protocol, or a small tweak to the WireGuard protocol. And this is actually really a small tweak. The idea is that in order to use a quantum computer to break WireGuard, you would need to recover the secret key from the public key, which, because it's an elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman key, you can do, except if you don't have the public key. So what they said is, well, the long-term keys, they're pre-installed anyway. So an attacker who's monitoring the whole internet and just observing handshakes wouldn't get those if we're not sending them around. So as part of the handshake, you are sending them around. So they just said, how about we just send the hash of the public key around? Then a surveillance attacker trying to attack on large scale many of these handshakes, and is not maybe compromising public keys of individual users, is, well, in the situation that they can't actually use their quantum computer. However, this is not really post-quantum security. It's essentially this idea that, well, if public keys aren't really public, we can't use them in an attack. But the security model is sort of tricky there. So we set out to really migrate WireGuard to post-quantum security. And what we wanted to do is not just provide post-quantum confidentiality, which you could probably get by just combining the ephemeral Diffie-Hellman with some ephemeral key exchange in a post-quantum setting, post-quantum KEM. But we also wanted authentication, post-quantum authentication. So we really want to understand what will this protocol look like, or what could it look like once attackers are equipped with a large universal quantum computer. We wanted to make sure that everything is running at NIST level 3, so that would be equivalent to AES 192. We wanted to retain all of the security properties of WireGuard, and we wanted to keep the efficient one round-trip handshake of WireGuard. We also, in this round-trip, didn't want any fragmentation of packets, because WireGuard is using UDP, and if you lose packets and if some filtering kicks in there, then you need to manage that in the state machine. And that makes the state machine more complex, which means the nice 4,000-line code protocol implementation will turn into something more extensive, harder to check, harder to verify. The packet size constraint coming from this requirement is that IPv6 guarantees that you don't have any fragmentation for packets of smaller than 1280 bytes. Now, in this is the IP header and the UDP header. So we need to fit WireGuard message into 1232 bytes. Pre-quantum, no problem. Like all of the public keys are just 32 bytes, X25519 keys. With post-quantum primitives, this actually proved to be a major challenge. We will see this in a moment. So the strategy for doing this was, well, let's just replace all of the Diffie-Hellman key exchanges in post-quantum in WireGuard by key encapsulation mechanisms, and then just instantiate those key encapsulation mechanisms with something that is post-quantum secure, something in the NIST competition, and then we have the desired security. All right, let's see if that works. First, as a reminder, we want to replace Diffie-Hellman with KEMs, and those are not the same things. So here is Diffie-Hellman, as you've many times seen this before. Alice is generating G to the A, Bob is generating G to the B. They send these public keys to each other and combine their respective secret keys with the respective public keys of the other person to obtain G to the AB. One thing that I think everyone here knows but hasn't actually drawn is the fact that we can swap the two arrows. So Bob can send first and Alice can send second. It doesn't matter. They can send at the same time. This is non-interactive. Alice doesn't need to know Bob's public key before computing her own public key. This is exactly what is different for a KEM. In a KEM, the initiator Alice is generating a key pair and sending the public key to Bob. But Bob isn't generating a public key. Bob is generating a ciphertext. And in order to generate that ciphertext, he needs the input of the public key from Alice. So in other words, we have a clear order in which things need to happen. And this actually turns out does make quite a difference, that we can't combine any secret key with any public key. We can only combine secret keys with ciphertexts. And ciphertexts are different objects than public keys. Why does that matter? Well, I should say, this is post-quantumly, this is basically as good as we get to, or as close as we get to Diffie-Hellman, except if you're considering C-side. So C-side was proposed after the NIST competition started. It's, I think, to me, one of, well, probably the most relevant and important post-quantum crypto paper in the last few years. It's by Kastrick, Lange, Martindale, Rines, and Pani from Asia Crypt 2018. And they propose a drop-in replacement for Diffie-Hellman. The concrete security is subject of heavy debate, and it's not exactly very fast. So performance would definitely suffer with this. But in principle, we could just replace all Diffie-Hellmans with something C-side and be done, probably. However, if we want to use KEMs, let's go back to that picture I showed earlier of the underlying basic idea of WireGuard. What we see is that 3 of these Diffie-Hellmans that we're doing out of the 4, we can straightforwardly replace with KEMs. The last one, however, combines a static secret key with a static public key. And that we can't do. We can't do a static Diffie-Hellman key exchange with KEMs. So let's first do the other 3. If we just do the other 3, that's basically what the protocol looks like. Initiator is generating key pair, ephemeral key pair. The initiator is encapsulating to the static public key of the responder, is sending the corresponding ciphertext over, is sending the public key, the ephemeral public key over here. The responder encapsulates to the static public key of the initiator, encapsulates to the ephemeral public key of the initiator, and then decapsulates the ciphertext that he received. And while the initiator is then decapsulating the 2 ciphertexts that they received. So you see now that on the channel we have 1 public key being sent around, and the other 3 objects that we send around are ciphertexts. That we can do. That we can rather straightforwardly implement. We still need to figure out how to instantiate things. Maybe what's interesting to know is that for the ephemeral keys, we can use a KEM that doesn't offer active security. It's enough to have something that is only in CPA secure, which is why we're distinguishing here between the CPA KEM and the CCA KEM. So for the long-term keys, we need something that is CCA secure. For the ephemeral one, we only need CPA security. Okay, so what are we missing? Well, we're missing DOS resistance. In the original WireGuard protocol, the static Diffie-Hellman key exchange gives us authentication of the first message. So if the first message fails authentication, the server can already reject the first message. as a solution, what we're proposing is to use this pre-shared key. So originally, WireGuard had pre-shared keys to offer some sort of post-quantum resistance. We're saying, well, if you're having pre-shared keys, we're using them a bit earlier in the handshake, and we use them for authentication of the first packet to be able to offer the same kind of DOS resistance. The second thing that we're missing is something called a max resistance. Max are maximum exposure attacks, which basically means assume that an attacker has compromised almost everything. So the only things that are not compromised is sort of the minimum set that you still need to somehow get some security properties. And one of the patterns that max attacks allow is that all random number generators are insecure. Well, you have the long-term keys. They have been generated outside of the current protocol flow. They assumed to be secure. They have maybe been generated in a trusted computing environment or something. But everything that's happening online right now, so all of the randomness drawn in the encapsulations is insecure. Now, in the Diffie-Hellman setting, we still have that static key exchange, and all static keys are assumed to be non-compromised here. So we're deriving some security from this. What we're proposing to do here is something that is often called the Naxos trick. It comes from the Naxos protocol, which says that all randomness that we're using needs to be generated from actual ephemeral randomness, which may be compromised, in a secure way together with some long-term secrets that are part of the uncompromised secret key. So we mix this together and then use that as ephemeral randomness. So even if the random number generator is compromised, we still have that long-term secret that gives us some protection. The third thing is this weird UKS attack notion. So which WireGuard wouldn't have without the static Diffie-Hellman. And the reason is that public keys are not hashed into the session key. So if you hashed all the public keys into the session key would be bound to those public keys, but that's not happening. So instead, the public keys essentially come in through the static Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So then you bind them. But if you remove this, you don't get the public keys in there anymore. So as a solution to this is, well, if you have a pre-shared key, you get UKS resistance also from the pre-shared key. But we want to make the pre-shared key optional. So we said, well, as a default value for this pre-shared key, if we don't set any, we're just using something that depends on the two static public keys. And then we bind the session keys again to the static keys. And that we do by just XORing the two keys and then hashing them. So with this, we obtain pretty much all the security properties that we want to get. And just to give you an idea, here's what the protocol looks like. Again, you won't be able to follow everything. If you want to, it will take you probably an hour going through the paper, tracking everything, where it's going in and out. You can see here that all the blue parts are the parts that we modified. So you see that instead of public keys, we're sending ciphertexts. You see that, well, there's now exactly these KEM operations happening. And you're seeing here that in these KEMs, we're making the randomness that goes into encapsulation explicit as the second argument. And this is generated as a KDF of sigma I and Ri, where Ri is sampled ephemeral random at runtime, and the sigma I is an additional component to the long-term secret key. So that we get this Naxos trick in there. So that's what you see in this line. Now, with this, we essentially submitted the paper. And we also showed proofs, and I'll come back to that in a bit. But then one of the proofs that we showed is an adapted version of the proof in the ECK PFS PSK model. And remember, that proof didn't actually apply to the protocol. It applied to the protocol if you add a key confirmation message. So then one of the reviewers said, well, it's nice that you have a protocol. It's nice that you have a proof. It would be even nicer if the proof actually matched the protocol. Fair point, hard to argue with. So for the revision of the paper, we then added this key confirmation message. So this is really now an additional message. It's not an additional round trip, because in parallel to that message, you can send already payload data. It just needs to be processed before you're processing the payload data, and well, potentially rejected if it isn't actually what you expect it to be. So as an additional last handshake message, we're sending this key confirmation message. So as I mentioned, proofs. Our paper shows two proofs. We have the computational proof, which is based on the proof by Dowling and Patterson, and just, well, modifies everything that needs to be modified because it's no longer Diffie-Hellman based, but it's KEM based. Actually, that makes the proof in a way cleaner, because for KEMs, we have a clear security notion associated. We say a KEM is in CPA secure, or we say a KEM is in CCA secure. For Diffie-Hellman, we don't really have such a clear security notion, indistinguishability security notion associated. So the original proof sort of came up, or well, reused actually from earlier works, definitions of Diffie-Hellman security, well, hash Diffie-Hellman security. So that's PRF ODH assumptions that are maybe a little bit messy, in particular because you can instantiate it only really in the random oracle model. We don't need those, and actually the whole rest of the proof is in the standard model. So this is very nice. We have the ECK PFS PSK model proof. Because I'm a huge fan of computer verified proofs, because it turns out that we're all humans, and when we're writing long proofs on paper, we tend to make mistakes. We also adapted the symbolic proof, the Tamarin machine-checked proof, based on the work by Donenfeld and Milner. And that one covers all of the desired security properties that we're having. But it's still complementary to the computational proof, because symbolic proofs inherently assume idealized cryptography. So this is just a matter of that if you don't have a key, you can't decrypt. There's no advantages to attackers or anything really in there. It's a very ideal world proof. Whereas the computational proofs take all of this into account. Now we have a KEM construction, KEM-based construction. So the next task was we need to instantiate that with some post-quantum KEMs. For the long-term KEM, it was very easy to choose, because for the long-term keys, we're never transmitting online the long-term public keys. We transmit them out of band. They're sort of assumed to sit around on the client and on the server. So what we really care about here is encapsulation and decapsulation performance and the size of the ciphertexts, mostly actually the size of the ciphertexts. Turns out that the scheme with the smallest ciphertexts is classic McAleese, often considered the most conservative choice among the NIST candidates. Very efficient encapsulation, decapsulation, key generation and public key generation time, public key size don't matter, so just use that. Done. The more tricky case was what we do for the ephemeral KEM, because for the ephemeral KEM we do need to transmit public keys, and classic McAleese is something like a 300 to 500 kilobyte public key. So this is something which we very clearly can't fit into one IPv6 packet. So we first wrote down the requirements we have, and we were totally fine with being cryptographically opinionated here and also just make a choice that everybody then needs to live with. So we wanted NIST PQC round 2 candidates at level 3. As a reminder, when we did this work, the round 3 candidates hadn't been announced yet, so we were basically stuck with round 2. We wanted something that already has high-speed, constant-time implementations. We wanted to pick something that is conservative. I'll come back to that. This is probably the most opinionated part of all of this. We wanted something that has no patent claims by the submitters. And if we have to tweak schemes, we definitely wouldn't want to tweak it in a way that it lowers cryptographic security of the scheme. As I mentioned before, we need to fit it into an unfragmented IPv6 packet. And with all of the other components of the messages that we're sending around, and with the McAleese ciphertext that we need to send around, we required something that has a public key that is smaller than 928 bytes and a ciphertext of smaller than 984 bytes. All right, so that is a clear list of requirements. So we could just look at the NIST candidates, and there were only 3 candidates that fit within the size constraints. That is Psych, which is not exactly known to be very high speed. There was Rollo, which was not very conservative, and actually there were comments by NIST saying exactly that they don't consider this very conservative. And there was round 5, which was patent encumbered. So back to the drawing board. What we thought is, all of the lattice-based KEMs in the NIST competition came actually fairly close in terms of size. And they were all CCA secure, but we don't need CCA security. So we said, okay, so what happens if we just take one of the NIST, lattice-based NIST candidates, remove the CCA security, and then tweak it until it fits? So we are okay with increasing the failure probability. We need an extremely low failure probability for CCA security, but if we're okay with just CPA security, a failure probability of 2 to the minus 30, probably more than okay. So the scheme that we in the end chose is Sabre. So we looked at Sabre, we removed the whole Fujisaki-Okamoto transform, we tweaked parameters such that it has a much higher failure probability, but at the same time, also an increased cryptographic hardness, because we're introducing more noise, which in lattice-based schemes means more security. And that modified scheme we call Dagger, so a smaller Sabre. With all of that, well, we implemented this as a Linux kernel module. We dropped in the high-speed constant time software for Mac-Elise and for Dagger, well, based on the existing Sabre software. And then we decided to compare to existing VPN solutions based on the amount of traffic we need to send around, the number of packets we need to send around, and the handshake latency. For this, we set up a virtual 10 gigabit per second Ethernet link between two VMs. And well, we tried both with IPv4 and IPv6, but the results were extremely similar. And then we compared this with, of course, plain WireGuard, with OpenVPN, with IPsec, and with PQ-VPN, which is a development by Microsoft. Here are the results. So as we can see, on top, in terms of performance, is WireGuard. Post-quantum WireGuard requires quite a bit more traffic. That is simply because the public key cryptographic objects we're sending around post-quantum objects are bigger. The latency for the handshake goes up by, well, on the client side, about a factor of 2, on the server side, a little less than that. We do believe that we can still improve this a bit. Most of this is, however, because it takes somewhat longer to transmit those packets because they're bigger. If we compare to IPsec, we can see that we're still way outperforming everything. So even IPsec with curve 25519, we're solidly a factor of 5 faster. And if you look at anything based on OpenVPN, the handshakes of OpenVPN are just so slow, we're a factor of 1,000 faster. So this is actually quite practical. We received quite some feedback afterwards. More people have looked into it, found a few small mistakes in the code. Some of the things we already addressed. I think it would be good if people could look into this. My intuition is that this could be something that actually pretty soon we can use. Also because VPNs are these kind of protocols where usually the same entity controls both endpoints. So server administrator can just decide to install maybe a patch to the Linux kernel that does post-quantum WireGuard, and then we all have post-quantum protection. In a second part, there's actually some Q&A here, so let me see. Okay, so maybe I'll quickly look at the questions here before I proceed to the second part that I want to briefly mention. Are we obliged to use ephemeral keys when initiating new sessions? Could we use only some randomness, which looks like a secret key? Would this make the scheme lose some security properties? You need to use actual ephemeral keys when initiating new sessions. I mean, a secret key, I'm not sure that I fully understand the question. So yes, if you have some randomness, like some ephemeral randomness sitting around, 32 bytes would be a common amount. That is essentially your secret key. I mean, you can generate the secret key from there and then use it. You really, in PQ-WireGuard, you really need to use fresh secret keys and can't just hash in some additional randomness. I'm hoping that this answers the question. Okay, as a second sort of case study that I wanted to at least briefly mention is KEMTLS, which is worked together with Douglas Tibila. Francisco? Yeah?
Yes, Peter, there are more questions. But
there's more questions in the chat, so okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so there is, out of curiosity, regarding the choices of algorithms for WireGuard, what are the choices that you would have made? Why? So I wouldn't have chosen Blake. I think, or Blake 2, or I think it's Blake 2S. Generally, my intuition is that if we're running through a very long standardization effort as in the SHA-3 effort, then afterwards just some losing team saying, oh, here's, by the way, an improved version that hasn't really received much attention or much cryptanalysis, and then just how about everybody use it. I'm a little bit concerned about that. I think it was brilliant marketing by Jean-Philippe, but I wouldn't, with the current status, recommend anyone to use Blake. Well, maybe Blake, but not Blake 2 or Blake 3. It's just my opinion. Aside from that, I prefer Salsa 20 over Cha-Cha 20, similar arguments. Salsa 20 was studied for a longer time. The disadvantages to Salsa 20 are, compared to Cha-Cha, are not that critical. I mean, Cha-Cha is a bit faster. By now, there is a bit more cryptanalysis for Cha-Cha 20 as well, since it's also in TLS. So maybe that's somewhat more comfortable. Then there's a question, what would be the approach for hybrid KEM and DH? We had long discussions about hybrid. That might actually be another paper. So one thing that we can do, which is rather easy, is that we only throw in, so full hybrid doesn't fit into the packets. So just really doing everything twice, and then you can combine things, and I'm relatively sure that we can fit a full hybrid, so both static key hybrid and ephemeral key hybrid, we can fit this, but that requires some more thought. We might also go for an option where not everything is hybrid. It's a bit tricky, but essentially we don't have additional 32 bytes in all packets available, and definitely not 64 bytes. So we need to be a bit careful, and then in particular the proof needs to be adapted. So that is I think the answer to that question. Okay, so let me close this here in the chat. Okay, so yeah, I hope that answers the questions. Otherwise, we go back to questions, I think, at the end, and then I can explain more. So the other work that I wanted to briefly present is KEMTLS, a joint work with Douglas Dabila and Tom Vickers. And in this work, we kind of wanted to figure out, or set out to understand, post-quantum TLS. And I think TLS doesn't need all that much of an introduction. Everybody's using TLS every day. But just as a reminder of what the handshake looks like from a high-level perspective is, the server has a static key, but that is not known to the client yet. So the client generates a Diffie-Hellman, a public key, sends it over to the server. The server generates a first session key from that by, chooses also a Diffie-Hellman share, computes a shared key, sends over the Diffie-Hellman share, signs all of that with the long-term key, and sends over the certified public key for the signature scheme so that the client can verify that signature, and the client verifies the signature on the other end and derives the same Diffie-Hellman key. And then they can communicate. The server can actually already here, very early in the handshake, send application data because the server has the session key already, and the server can authenticate using that signature key. There is a rather straightforward post-quantum adaptation to that. And that is, well, of course, for the signatures, we need to use some post-quantum signature scheme. But for the Diffie-Hellman key exchange here is almost used like a KEM. So it's a very straightforward replacement to, replace this Diffie-Hellman generation plus Diffie-Hellman shared key computation with just an encapsulation to the public key, which basically gives back both things, the ciphertext and the shared key. So it's a little bit of like a syntax difference, but aside from that, it's protocol flow-wise very much the same. And if you followed a little bit the post-quantum TLS experiments by Google and by Cloudflare, this is what they're doing. They're not even using post-quantum signatures there, they're just using a post-quantum KEM. And then they're using it in a hybrid setting with pre-quantum elliptic-curve Diffie-Hellman. So that's just straightforward. Well, straightforward is in quotation marks because from an engineering point of view, this is still a major effort. And as soon as you're sending suddenly much bigger objects around as part of the handshakes, certain things break on the internet because they were not prepared for this. And when you're starting using post-quantum signatures, things become even bigger, and you need to figure out what the right parameter choices are. There's a lot of engineering to be done. But purely academically, on a sort of elevated protocol level point of view, this is straightforward. Nevertheless, we wanted to figure out if we can do this in a sort of different way, and sort of in a similar spirit to post-quantum WireGuard, or also to WireGuard, namely without any signatures. So just derive the authentication properties also from long-term KEM keys, like we do in post-quantum WireGuard. And this idea is inspired by the OpTLS proposal, which was sort of put forward by Krafczyk and we in 2015 as part of the TLS 1.3 standardization, but then never gained that much traction. So there was some follow-up on this, but it's not something that we would be using every day today. Now, why would we be doing this? I mean, it sounded like, well, a bit of engineering required. We drop in post-quantum signatures, we do post-quantum KEMs, we're done with TLS. Well, yes, could do, but post-quantum KEMs are more efficient than post-quantum signatures, and actually significantly so. So there's something to be gained here by just saying, well, let's not use the somewhat inefficient signatures, but rather use the somewhat more efficient KEMs for authentication. Also, well, in an elliptic curve world, we can build signatures and Diffie-Hellman all from elliptic curve scalar multiplication. So we can sort of keep our trusted code base, so the core software that we rely on, that we need to optimize, that we need to secure, we can keep that relatively small. For post-quantum primitives, signature is completely different code base than the key agreement, than any KEM. Almost, except maybe for the hash function that both are using. So we wanted to figure out if we can do better. And now you might wonder, well, okay, sure, you can, right? You did it in PQ-WireGuard, just do the same thing for TLS and you're done. Well, not quite. There's one major challenge, and that is that in post-quantum WireGuard, we assumed that the client and the server already know each other's long-term keys at the beginning of the handshake. And we don't have that in TLS. In TLS, at least quite commonly, a browser connects to a server that the browser has never talked to before. And the public key is being sent over as part of the handshake. So we need to deal with that. Additionally, not so much of a challenge, but more something that is different is that the authentication here is typically only unilateral. So here's the idea. You can just write all of this down. Basically, you assume that now the server has a long-term KEM key, static KEM key. And then, well, the client needs to obtain that key, which is in the first message from the server. So this is the certified public key of the server here. And then the client can encapsulate to that server's key, which gives implicit authentication because the only person, the only entity that can read this message is the server. So this application data that the client sends here in the first round trip, that would be implicitly authenticated because the client knows that only the server can read it. What you see, what changes is that because the server in its first round trip can't authenticate, the server can only send the public key, but they can't sign anything with this public key. So in other words, this gray arrow here of the server sending application data in the first round trip, that goes away. We don't have that anymore. So application level protocols where it's critical that the server in the first flight needs to send data to the client before the client can do anything, they're in a sort of more messy situation. But quite often, the client connects to the server. The server doesn't actually even know yet what the client wants. So it's the client who's sending first the application level data. And that is in the same round trip here. However, when you look at these two pictures, it looks like KEMTLS, what we're proposing. It just looks way more complicated. There's more arrows going back and forth. Well, just at least more arrows. It's more computation. It just looks like it can't really be more efficient. Or can it? Well, the situation here is a bit more complicated than in PQ-WireGuard. We actually do have several advantages and we have several disadvantages. The advantages are we do actually get faster handshake times, although not by all that much, at least not on the experiments that we measured. We rather drastically decrease the computational effort for the server, also for the client. we are able to pretty significantly reduce the bandwidth requirements of the protocol. That depends on the instantiation. We end up with a much smaller trusted code base, so we don't need any signing code anymore on the server. We still need verification code because we need to verify the certificate signatures, but we don't need any signatures anymore, any signing, online signing. And that means, because we don't do online signing anymore, we can choose parameters for post-quantum signatures that make them smaller but slower. So we don't require low latency signing anymore. It's quite interesting because TLS has often been mentioned as one of the applications that really need low latency, very fast signing. Now, the disadvantages are, as I said, we can't send any payload together with the first server message. Also, I said the first message from the client is implicitly authenticated. We sort of retroactively obtain explicit authentication with a server finished message. But that is only later in the handshake. And maybe the biggest drawback that requires discussion is that the cipher suite in TLS is not fixed and cryptographically opinionated, that we can choose it. It's negotiated as part of the handshake. And this negotiation is also only authenticated later. So the early messages actually use a cipher suite that hasn't been authenticated yet. The paper discusses some options of how to address this and how to live with this, but that is, I think, maybe the most tricky aspect to deal with. Let me put some numbers on this. So when we look at the latency for handshake establishment, you can see, so I should explain this a little bit. So this ERRR is the pre-quantum comparison. So this is elliptic-curve Diffie-Hellman with RSA signatures, both or for the handshake, for the intermediate certificate, and for the root certificate. So we assume one intermediate certificate in the certificate chain. And then, well, if the client caches that intermediate certificate, then we can exclude it from all of the computations. And if the client does not cache intermediate certificates, then we need to include it. So that's always the left and the right side. And we see here, then SFXR is a cipher suite that is optimized for size post-quantumly, and that uses Cyc together with Falcon, together with XMSS for intermediate signatures, tweaked stateful signatures that we believe CAs can actually manage, and then Rainbow for the root signature. And then we have the KDDD, K stands for Kyber, D stands for dilithium. That is essentially a cipher suite mostly based on problems on module lattices. And N and F uses Entru and Falcon, so that uses problems based on Entru lattices. On KEMTLS, well, basically, for the authentication, instead of the handshake signatures, we're using KEMs. So we're using Entru for this instead of Falcon. We're using Kyber of this instead of dilithium. We're using Cyc for this instead of Falcon here. We see that the times go up if we replace Falcon by Cyc. And that's simply because Cyc is actually pretty slow. And on a fast network, you see this computation time. We also see, however, that if you're basing everything on lattice-based cryptography, then we become slightly faster. It's not actually very significant, but you see that Kyber is actually somewhat faster than dilithium here. So that is the effect that you see between the 95.1 and the 94.8. But overall, everything lattice-based is so fast that it almost completely vanishes in the network delays, even on a fast network. More impressive numbers, this is the computation time we spend on server and client for TLS versus KEMTLS. And here what you're seeing is that, for example, when we move from Kyber and dilithium to Kyber and Kyber, then on the server side, we go from 0.072 milliseconds to just 0.017. So this is an improvement by a factor of 5. Similar when we include the CA certificate, and similar also for when we're going, for example, from, or even more dramatically, when we replace Falcon by Entru. It's a factor of 10 improvement of what the server can save here. And then, quite interestingly, if you really care about how many bytes you're transmitting, which for some embedded applications is actually quite relevant, you can see that if we really optimize for size, we can get down from around 3 kilobytes to 1.85 kilobytes. Pretty dramatic saving. But also in the pure lattice-based worlds, we can go from 7.7 to 5.5, or from 3.6 to 3.5. So Falcon and Entru are actually very close in terms of sizes. But dilithium and Kyber not so much. Now, this is basically what we published in the KEMTLS paper. And then in follow-up work, we said, so what happens if this main challenge that we had, namely that the client doesn't know the server's public key yet, what if that doesn't hold? What if the client does already know the server's public long-term key? There's many good reasons why this might be the case. So for example, you may have an IoT device that just only ever communicates with one server, and you have that public key pre-installed. Or in your browser, if you just cache the public keys of the most visited 100 sites, that is actually probably a large percentage of your internet or web surfing handshakes that you're doing. You might pre-distribute those keys. So for example, there's an RFC describing how to do this over DNS. Or if you're thinking how many people are using TLS now in mobile apps, where an app may just be communicating to a couple of servers and have those keys pre-installed. So as I said, we looked at this in a separate paper. And the summary is, well, you get all of the advantages of KEMTLS without any of the disadvantages. Maybe that is not super surprising, because all of the disadvantages that we saw were an artifact of the fact that the server can't authenticate in the first message. And the reason for that was, well, that the client doesn't know its long-term key. What also becomes interesting is that a different set of post-quantum KEMs now becomes the optimal choice. This is very similar to post-quantum WireGuard. So essentially, McAleese with the huge public keys now becomes the most efficient one. There's still quite some work going on at the moment. There's a real-world experiment in collaboration with Cloudflare, and there's a paper online with preliminary results. There's work on an internet draft for this, and that has been submitted to the IETF and is currently being discussed. And I also included the link of that. And then there's very much work in progress still by Jonathan Hoyland and Tom Bichers. They're looking into formal verification of KEMTLS using also the Tamarin prover. With this, I would like to show you just a few more resources online. There's, of course, the post-quantum WireGuard paper online and the corresponding software. There's the KEMTLS paper online and the KEMTLS with pre-distributed keys that I mentioned at the end. And also the KEMTLS software with all of the experiments we're running is online. So with this, I would like to close and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. We have some questions. I don't know if you want to read them or.
Let me take a look here.
Yeah. Very interesting talk. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. So there's a question about TLS 1.3 client-side PKI authentication. So we can also do KEMTLS with client authentication. The details are in the two papers. Essentially, when you're doing client authentication and you're doing KEMTLS where the client doesn't know the server's key in advance, you're paying an additional round trip. If the client already knows the server's public key, which my guess is for most applications with client authentication is the case, then it's actually also quite efficient. So that would be also described in the PDK, so the pre-distributed key paper, which is, yeah. Any other questions?
You mentioned, Peter, that in the case of the PQ-WireGuard, you decided to choose security level 3, NIST security level 3. Why?
Yeah. So to me, so one thing is, of course, I wanted the challenge. If you do NIST security level 1, it's becoming rather trivial to instantiate everything and fit everything. If you're using security level 5, you won't fit anything. This is relatively simple. And 2 and 4 are not even instantiated by most KEMs, because that would be, they don't really, yeah. This hash function security of SHA-256 and SHA-512 doesn't really pop up so much in KEM constructions. So this security level 3 for me is maybe the most relevant level. It's what I'm hoping. So I would hope that applications don't go for this level security level 1. I understand some applications are very conservative, don't care too much about performance. They will go for 5 or maybe even higher and ask for custom parameter sets with even more conservative security. So I've had those discussions, and that's great, that's cool. If you care about performance, then I would hope that people go for at least level 3. It feels much more comfortable than level 1. So I would also recommend everyone not to use AES 128, but at least AES 192. The reasoning is maybe a bit complicated. So I don't really see a single key of AES 128 broken with Grover anytime soon. But I think discussing the exact security against Grover in a multi-key setting, so multi-target setting, this is just all so much harder to argue why you don't, why 128, AES 128 is okay in your application than just going for AES 192 or 256. This is, I think every application should have a way of migrating that allows them to go for somewhat bigger keys. The performance increase of 20% from AES 128 to 192, I don't believe really an argument for almost any application. So I would hope people go for AES 192 and for NIST level 3 everywhere, at least.
And save the discussion about the
different you save yourself a whole lot of discussion, and in the context of the post-quantum schemes, I would not be terribly surprised if attacks improve over the next decade. For some schemes, I would be a bit more surprised than for others. I think for hash-based signatures, so for Sphinx Plus or XMSS, I think there I would be most surprised if attacks improve. In the single target setting, multi-target attacks we've had quite some discussions now, but there's no multi-target serious proof for that. But in the single target setting, I don't think attacks will improve there very much. At least not when you're considering everything with SHA-3. If you're considering things with Haraka, I'm not so sure. Or if you're, SHA-2 also still seems pretty all right. For lattice-based crypto, I would probably expect some improvements. Code-based crypto is probably somewhat more stable, but even there, if in the next decade or so we see some improvements, wouldn't be terribly surprised.
Okay. So we have one more last question. Time for one more question. Is in the chat? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. When both using McAleese and Dagger, there's a very conservative choice with McAleese paired with a less conservative choice. By breaking Dagger, many of the properties can be broken. Is this approach of mixing different security and threat in the opening? It's actually a quite interesting thing. So what we discussed is, so you need Dagger only for forward security. Now, if you don't do the ephemeral thing, then you still have all of the security properties essentially derived from the static keys. So you could say that as long as your long-term keys aren't being compromised, you obtain pretty much all properties you care about from the very conservative McAleese choice. So basically what an attacker would need to do to really break something would be to cryptographically break Dagger and then compromise long-term keys in McAleese. Then it's game over. But maybe that's actually not too bad as a trade-off. Also, I wouldn't say that Dagger is, it's somewhat less conservative maybe. It is, I mean, Sabre is one of the finalists in the NIST competition. And what we did by tweaking it is essentially making it more secure. Making the underlying lattice problem harder. So most people would think that any lattice-based scheme is less conservative than McAleese. But among the lattice-based schemes that are still in the competition, structured lattice-based schemes that are still in the competition, I wouldn't say that it's one of the worst choices. The reason, by the way, why we didn't use Kyber is that in order to make the messages small enough, we need to apply public key compression. And in Kyber, we can't do this without violating the security proof. That is essentially the mistake that Kyber made in the first round. Whereas in Sabre, we can compress public keys and without violating the security proof. And the reason is that we need to round to a smaller modulus that divides the original modulus. And Sabre, we have a power of 2 modulus, so we can do this. But in Kyber, we have a prime modulus, so we cannot do this.